In today's episode, we're talking with Justin, project leader for GodTools, about how we can overcome those barriers to starting spiritual conversations. Thank you, Justin. Thank you for joining us. Glad you're able to join the show today.
Happy to be here.
So you've had a lot of roles in the past in UX design, advertising, art direction. Right now, you're a project leader for an app called GodTools. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
As you said, I've my background has been in UX, web design, advertising, and so we're applying a lot of those same fundamentals, those principles of user-centered design to GodTools. So looking at this app and really building out the value proposition for a wider and in fact global audience. So my role is pretty specifically helping a little bit of everything, working on a little bit of each of our projects, managing our processes, but really just leading the product as a whole and kind of the brand, since, of course, we have an app and that's very fundamental to our brand. And that's what most people know about, but we're also pushing into a blog, Instagram, and some other places because we know that users don't just exist in one area. They use a whole suite of products and channels.
I recently signed up for the blog tips that you give out, where there's like tips every month or so that give you things to try out, and I always love getting those tips.
Yeah, they're very helpful, and I think that little bit longer form content helps a lot of people just um, see it demonstrated rather than it just kind of being a 3 or 5 minute read. Um, it's something a little longer, and we often include videos in there of people talking pretty specifically about their story and how they share their faith.
So one of the things we're talking about right now is what holds people back from sharing their faith, and we know that most Christians don't regularly share their faith. A lot of Christians have never done so. So I wanted to look into really the reasons that people give for why they don't do that, what holds them back. So I found a Barna study, and I believe it's based in the U.S., so it may not resonate with every part of the world, but it's gives an idea of a lot of things that people list of being the reason that they don't share their faith. So I want to go through those, and I'll read them all, and then we can talk about each one. But Barna interviewed Christians and non-Christians for why they don't engage in spiritual conversations, and the ones that relate to Christian audience were the top ones that I picked out were the first one is religious conversations always seem to create tension or arguments. Second one is I don't feel like I know enough to talk about spiritual topics. The third one is I don't know how to talk about spiritual topics without sounding weird. And the last one is I'm afraid people will see me as a fanatic or extremist. Do any of those surprise you, or does that kind of fit with, what you've heard and what you've seen?
Yeah, we do a lot of user research, and so we in some way we've heard all of these, and I think what's unique is that we don't just hear them from one part of the globe. So many of these are it's a global problem. A lot of people don't know how to start conversations about Jesus, so there's plenty of things for us to offer.
So the first one, religious conversations always seem to create tension or arguments. That's one, whether it's in person or online, we've certainly seen a lot of conversations where you want to talk about God because it's important to you. The other person doesn't believe the same as you do. They might be antagonistic, and they vehemently disagree with your beliefs, and it just turns into this big argument, and that doesn't help anyone. So do you have any thoughts on, man, how can I stop doing that? How can I have these conversations without it being a big argument?
Yeah, well, I think there is a little bit of a distinction here that conversations about religion are actually something that we God tools aren't trying to push out into, and so we talk about
Mm.
conversations about Jesus. Um, because we don't want people to be sort of categorically trying to shift someone into a new bucket. We want them to talk personally about the way that the gospel's actually affected them. And so we recommend people lead with gentleness and respect. Gentleness can be just asking good follow-up questions and seeking to empathize with their point of view. And then respect is just kind of taking that step back to say like, hey, I think I've like offended you, or I'm not sure how this resonates with you, but tell me what you think. So it just allows you to kind of take some of the pressure off of the conversation by making it a two-way conversation, that it's not
Mm.
you talking at them or they them berating you. Instead it can actually just be a really empathetic relationship building experience.
I think one of the best tips that I was told is that one of the best things you can do is just listen with empathy to the other person. Listen to what they think and what they believe, and listen without judgment. Because if they don't have the same relationship with God that you do, you can't expect them to believe the same things about God as you do, and
Mm,
just start from a place of empathy.
totally.
The next reason is I don't feel like I know enough to talk about spiritual topics. There's this thinking that, well, maybe someone will ask me a question I don't know. They'll be like, okay, how can you prove that this is true, or whatever it is. What do you think about that?
I mean, we're going to get into this more about the app, but like this is exactly what GodTools is made for. It's built for people like you and me, and sure, people may see us as I wouldn't consider myself a pro evangelist, but the reality is there are people and situations and instances where I need help. Right, there are certain people that I can talk to about faith all day long, but there are other people where it's like my brain goes out the window. I don't know where to start. I have no idea. So you're never going to reach a point where you know enough and you can just share all the time with 100% confidence perfectly. Um, but this is where, for us as a product, we really go back to the idea of like one good question or one really well thought out idea is sometimes way more impactful than a rehearsed synopsis of the gospel. And the reality is that a lot of people are actually like really ready to talk about faith. I'm sure we've heard that from
Mhm.
a lot of research studies, but in reality, it's true. And that's what we found is that a couple of good questions often open the door way wider than asking someone outright, hey, can we talk about faith? And I know that's a huge hurdle for people. So,
Yeah, and you brought up one thing that I want to make sure we come back to, and that's that even for someone who shares their faiths pretty regularly or has experience doing it, it's not necessarily something that's always easy. So a lot of people, especially if they've never done it or rarely do it, they might think, "Oh man, it's just not for me." Maybe those other people, they're awesome at it, and it comes easy to them. But I think for most people I've talked to, even people that I would assume, "Oh yeah, they talk about Jesus all the time. It must be super easy and like never awkward or anxious for them." And they totally feel awkward and anxious, but they still do it.
oh yeah, no, it is. It is so situational, and it's humbling because we can talk about, do X, Y, Z, and A plus B equals C, and that's how you do it. But in reality, it's not like that. The world and conversations about faith are often a lot more messy and kind of ad hoc than we'd like to admit.
So the next topic is the next reason people give is I don't know how to talk about spiritual topics without sounding weird. That one probably again relates to the previous one of just like not being experienced with it. So, you have any thoughts about how do I do it without sounding like a weirdo?
Yeah, same. Honestly,
Yeah.
same. And it is situational that there are certain people, unbelieving friends, friends who are kind of on the fence that I can talk to about faith, but there are plenty of other people that it's just it's going to sound weird. It's going to be strange. And this is where I would go back to kind of one of my previous answers too, of talking about your personal story. Like, how has God showed up? How has the gospel made a difference in your life? Because if there's one thing that we experience often is that your story matters fundamentally. Um, People can't argue with your experience. They can't argue with the way that you have grown and changed over time. And so often it's sharing the way that the gospel has actually made you a true believer, or the way that the gospel has actually changed your life for the better, is maybe where you start. Because I mean, I think plenty of us are conversationally awkward in general. So that's a problem I wrestle with. But when you share your story, it's going to sound way less canned, way less strange or weird. So I always recommend starting there.
The last reason that people point out a lot is I'm afraid people will see me as a fanatic or an extremist. And depending on your culture and your part of the world, that can mean completely different things. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on sharing without seeing like an extremist?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things for listeners is just to realize that that's a real thing. Real people all across the globe have different perspectives on this, but it is. I hate to say a rising trend, but it's a real thing that comes up in our research all the time. Um, for us, we always kind of focus on uh, listen well. Listening well takes so much of the pressure out of the conversation. Be curious, follow up with people, um, because like I was kind of saying before, when it's your story, um, you can't argue, and you can see where people are able to agree and empathize with you when you're sharing your story. So being curious, um, and kind of doing those follow-up questions to what someone else is saying allows you to interject your own insights. Oh yeah, I've experienced that, and this is how I dealt with it. So focus on listening, be curious, and then you can inject those insights and empathize with them. And so by sort of just having this very regular conversation where you're listening, asking good follow-up questions, and then saying, "Oh yeah, I've been there too," it's actually just normal conversation. And so yeah, I mean that's what God Tools is all about. Is um, of course there's many instances we want to present the gospel, but there are many instances we just want to have a conversation about Jesus. And yeah, so that's why we're here.
Yeah. So let's talk about God Tools. What is it, and how do people use it? And yeah, just tell us about that.
Yeah, God Tools is a app that began in 2010. Um, Originally, it was started by a sort of collaboration between some of the Australian ministry and the US, to allow some gospel presentations to exist on a really accessible global platform. Of course, apps were still kind of new in 2010, really catching on and becoming more widespread. But what we've grown into is really that global platform. We just hit 102 languages in the app, which is really exciting, and so we are seeing
Wow.
users all over the place, and so it's a very encouraging product to lead. Um, but we have quite a few different offerings. We have lessons that help you sort of learn how to really think about evangelism and overcome some of these obstacles. We have tools that are designed to help you in a conversation talk about the gospel, and then we even have articles and some really cool features that I'm excited to highlight later.
One of the things on there, and the thing that really started God Tools were just like the gospel presentations, things like knowing God personally, for example. Can you tell us what those are and how they can be used?
Yeah. So knowing God personally, for example, is a short. Uh, we use the category gospel presentation because it's really focused on presenting a simple and clear outline of the gospel that is in some ways transferable, in that it's very easy to memorize. It's easy to kind of remember the key points. um, that combines scripture and these sort of key points of the gospel into a really sleek package. Um, uh, some gospel presentations are made for different audiences too.
Right.
There's sort of no one size fits all for the entire globe, of course. Um, but all of these kind of talk about the gospel in a different way, and we see that in the Bible. There are people who um, become believers not through one set ABC. This is they're now a Christian. In reality, it's right. It could be the road to Damascus, and that is still 100% real conversion. That's the gospel being presented and shared. Um, so, like KGP, the Knowing God Personally booklet versus Honor Restored, like those are made for kind of different audiences. They talk about the gospel in a little different way, but yeah, we kind of let people self-select there because it's you don't exactly know how those things are going to speak to different people.
And I think that's one of the things when we talked about the problem people have of I don't know enough to share the gospel. Those gospel presentations really help with that. So it really, I love that they boil down what's really a very complex and long narrative and thing that you to understand into something pretty simple and easy to explain.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, what's great is that these have been tested for years and years in paper forms, in digital forms. We have the ability to iterate on some of them and help improve them for different audiences, as well as it's hard to say that the exact language for knowing God personally in English should be perfectly represented in Swahili. Um, and so we get to work with a lot of translators and people who are contextualizing uh, that information into something that makes more sense for that audience.
Yeah, and you mentioned the different languages. It's in 102 different languages. So you can actually switch back and forth if you're talking to someone, or maybe your first language isn't their first language, right?
Yeah, yeah, we see a lot of that. Surprisingly, in places where we wouldn't have thought that we would see, Korean show up in Romania, or that we would see Swahili show up in Mexico, but it happens and it's real. And so it's a really powerful thing to be able to uh, give, for example, me the confidence to read a gospel presentation in my language, English, but also to be able to share with someone and have them hear it and read it in their own language at the same time. So yeah, the parallel language feature is a pretty huge thing for us.
Yeah, and you talked about it having lessons as well that can kind of teach you how to have these conversations. And one of them I know is called Teach Me to Share. I've gone through that myself and found it really helpful. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Teach Me to Share, we have categorized as a lesson. I'm sorry, as a tool inside of GodTools. So
Okay.
it's a training tool that it, in some ways it points to lessons, but it also sort of teaches you broadly how to use GodTools, how to think about asking for permission or responding or preparation before. Um, so holistically, it's really kind of this idea of um, hey, we know that you may not know everything, but we're going to give you a few great steps in the right direction. And so that's kind of how we think about God tools metaphorically, is that God tools is kind of like a flashlight, where when you're in the dark, um, you, you could maybe have a flashlight in your back pocket. And maybe your
Mhm.
flashlight's not going to be able to show you how to walk, 2 miles in the dark, but we can give you a few good steps in the right direction. And so that's where Teach Me to Share starts. Um, but also that's where I think lessons goes even further and talks more specifically rather than kind of holistically into things like how to share your God story, or how to listen well, or how do you handle hostility in a conversation. So lessons are these short, linear digital experiences that really just highlight these specific topics really well and make them feel practical.
Yeah, and there's also a new tool that's called openers that I just started messing around with and trying out. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So openers was this idea of what if we gave people really good conversation starters, things that are open the conversation, that's the name. Um, and so it's really designed to just help you get into the conversation and you take it from there. Because as we said before, there is no one way to get into a conversation about Jesus. And so maybe you ask a really good question about someone's family background or about a recent job change that they had, and there are very natural and honest and authentic ways to start talking about Jesus that go from topics like that into, well, how did you grow up in your family? Did you guys go to church? How did growing up in your family change the way you see the world? Um, and so there are just really natural ways that we are seeking to help people get into those conversations. And openers is kind of one of those big ones.
Yeah, it's especially good for anyone who's an introvert like me that's not great at starting conversations, period, no matter what the topic is.
Hey, same. I'm right there with you. I think sometimes I'm the perfect use case for GodTools and openers, especially. It's I can go through a 10-week training on how to share my faith, and sometimes that stuff doesn't stick, but to have like three really good openers that are just always kind of top of mind for me is way more effective and powerful.
So there are a lot of different tools with God tools. The app, plus, as you said, it's a whole ecosystem that has a bunch of other stuff as well. So I'd like to go through like a hypothetical situation. If I'm going to be meeting a friend soon for coffee, and I have the GodTools app, but there's tons of tools in there. There's tools, there's lessons, there's openers. I have an email series that I subscribe to, and there's all these things. Like, what should I do before, during, and after meeting this friend to really maximize the experience for that person and to make it easier for me?
Yeah, well, I think we always want to encourage people to just have that honest conversation with God first. Pray about it. If you're not asking Him to lead you to show up, unfortunately, it's not gonna go well. To be honest,
Mhm.
so we always encourage people to pray first. Um, the next kind of starting point that, at least for me, where I start prior to a conversation is I jump into a lesson that feels relevant. Um, Often it's ones about listening well, or I mean, the one about moving your conversations to a deeper level is a really big one for me, because I can stay at this sort of very high level, external, easy conversation. I mean, I think I could talk about the weather for a half hour and kind of never go deeper. But yeah, that lesson especially, it just gives you at the end a few really good tips on how to move those conversations to a deeper level. Um, Another prior to is just to familiarize yourself with a tool. Um, it could be knowing God personally. It could be on restored. There's several others, but to have the gospel summarized in a very simple way that's kind of in the back of your mind, on the tip of your tongue, is powerful. But also, it may not be the right time for that particular conversation. Um, During a conversation, I may use an opener to kind of start talking about those things. And depending on how it progresses, I may say, like, hey, I actually have a really good outline of the gospel. Any chance I could just share it with you? And I think asking permission is actually a really important thing. Um,
Mm.
so when we look at that, and depending on how it all goes, there's the option for them to actually even pray a prayer and get their own follow up series afterwards if they have more questions. And one great thing about God Tools is that it doesn't have to be the beginning and the end of a conversation. It can help you continue the conversation. We always want to leave the door open, and so maybe they're not ready to make a personal commitment of faith, and so hey, that's okay. I'm still here. I'm still your friend. Maybe I can sign you up for this series that could answer some of your questions. Um, And so, if we start with prayer and we move into some very practical help, um, that's really the way that we're hoping that God Tools is helping people, by giving them practical steps that move them closer and closer to actually being able to do something when it comes to sharing their faith. Because we can consume a lot of stuff that it kind of ends up being head knowledge, but ultimately, the more practical things that are at your fingertips, the more likely you are to actually use them.
And you mentioned that the person just might not be ready yet. So one of the things, people can get discouraged if you pray about this and then you have the conversation and you really want them to accept Jesus because that's important, and then they're not there. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to get discouraged because you come into these things thinking that it's going to go one way, but I think you have to start sometimes realizing that this is a relationship. It is give and take. It can't just be, all right, I'm here and I'm gonna, you know, go from A to Z, and we're gonna talk super deeply about
Right.
this thing. So I think just realizing that uh, having a conversation about Jesus is not the end point and it's not the start
Mhm.
point. It's somewhere in the middle. And there's a lot of gray in these. I've had spiritual conversations that have gone poorly for years and years and years. And then I've asked a couple good questions, and it has opened up a world of possibilities, and a world of depth into that relationship and into being able to talk about faith and Jesus, and even seeing people become believers where I thought it was just not going to happen. Um, and so realizing that sometimes it's a long term game, and I think uh, I go back to praying and preparing your heart, because you are putting yourself out there um, to in some way kind of be a little heartbroken, because you're putting yourself on the line. You're doing something with a relationship that's new, and that's hard. So we always are here to encourage you. God Tools is there to give you practical help, but realizing that, yeah, it may not go to plan, is just part of it.
And ultimately, coming to faith in Jesus is something that happens in their heart, and that's not something we can control. It's something
Definitely.
only God can control after all.
Yeah, definitely. I think it takes some experience and quite a bit of wisdom. And I know I'm not the best at it, but asking the Holy Spirit to give you that insight to see whether or not they're ready to make that sort of leap of faith. It's a difficult spot to be, but it takes wisdom, it takes experience. But yeah, I think that's where starting with prayer is just huge. You have to be praying and thinking about the person you want to have a conversation with before you're willing to uh, really jump in sometimes.
Thank you. This has been great. A lot of really helpful information and a lot of really helpful stuff with God tools. Do you have any last tips for someone who's reluctant to start spiritual conversations?
Yeah, well, I would recommend that you rehearse or just think through your own story of how the gospel has really been made clear and real to you. Um, we have a lesson called the Power of Your God Story, which is maybe a 5-6 minute read that takes people through how to craft what we would maybe call your testimony. But it's in reality, it can be little things. Like I was really stressed at work and I prayed, and I had a friend reach out and we had a great conversation that really encouraged me. Like in reality, that is the gospel experienced.
Mhm.
So I would go back to say, figure out what is a transferable and easy to understand expression of the gospel in your own life. Um, yeah, because for me, that's worked. That's been a place that I go to, and that I've always just had better reception from friends and family that I've talked to about those things.
So, someone wants to get GodTools, they should go to the website. Is it godtoolsapp.com?
Yeah, godtoolsapp.com, or you can search GodTools in the App Store or Play Store. We're in both spots.